January 17, 1944. The Atlantic wind howled across the cliffs of Normandy, slicing through the morning mist like a blade through silk. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood alone at the edge of the fortifications near Weestrum, his leather coat snapping in the gale, his eyes fixed on the gray horizon where sea met sky in an indistinguishable line. In his gloved hand, he held a single rusted iron stake, one of thousands that would soon bristle along these beaches like the quills of some vast mechanical beast. He turned it over slowly, feeling its weight, its inadequacy. The stake was cold, unfinished, a fragment of a defense that existed more on paper than in reality. Behind him, concrete bunkers stood incomplete, their steel reinforcements exposed to the salt air like ribs through torn flesh. Rommel knew what was coming. He had seen it in North Africa, the scale, the fury, the industrial might of American machinery when it decided to break you. And here, along this 50-mile stretch of French coastline, he saw only illusion, a fortress of hope built on sand. The German High Command called it the Atlantic Wall. Hitler himself had proclaimed it impregnable, a rampart of steel and concrete that would shatter any invasion before it reached the waterline. From Norway to the Spanish border, millions of tons of concrete had been poured, millions of man-hours invested in creating what propaganda called Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. But Rommel, who had arrived in France in November 1943 to inspect Army Group B's coastal defenses, saw through the mythology within days. He saw bunkers facing the wrong direction. He saw minefields that existed only in reports. He saw artillery positions without ammunition, tank divisions without fuel, and beaches protected by obstacles that hadn't yet been built. Most dangerously, he saw generals who believed their own propaganda, who thought will and ideology could substitute for steel and preparation. Rommel had fought the British in the deserts of Libya and Egypt. He had matched wits with Montgomery at El Alamein. He understood the material reality of modern warfare in a way his colleagues, safe in their chateaux and confident in their theories, did not. He knew that when the Allies came, and they would come, they would bring with them a tide of industrial production that Germany could not match, could not slow, could not survive unless it was stopped immediately, violently, at the water's edge. This was not 1940. This was not the France that had collapsed in 6 weeks beneath the weight of blitzkrieg. The Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable force it had been. 4 years of war had bled it across 2 continents. The Eastern Front consumed entire army groups like a furnace consuming fuel. The best divisions, the most experienced soldiers, the newest equipment, all of it flowed east toward the endless Russian steppe, where millions died in a war of annihilation that had no foreseeable end. What remained in the west were garrison troops, old men, teenagers, recovered wounded, and units cobbled together from occupation duties. The 709th Infantry Division defending Utah Beach had an average age of 36, ancient by Wehrmacht standards. Many coastal divisions were static formations, lacking transport, relying on horses and bicycles, filled with foreign conscripts who spoke no German and had no particular desire to die for Hitler's Reich. The panzer divisions that might have made the difference, the 12th SS Panzerjugend, the Panzer Lehr Division, the 21st Panzer Division, were held inland, scattered across France under a command structure so Byzantine, so riven with competing authorities and jealousies that deploying them quickly would require Hitler's personal authorization, and Hitler slept late.
Rommel understood this. He understood that Germany's only chance was to destroy the invasion at its most vulnerable moment, in the first hours, on the beaches, when the Allied soldiers would be exhausted from the crossing, seasick, disoriented, pinned between the sea and the cliffs with nowhere to retreat. Every military principle argued for defeating the enemy at his weakest point, but this required having forces positioned forward, obstacles constructed in depth, and authority decentralized so that commanders on the ground could react immediately to the developing situation. Instead, Rommel found the opposite. He found a defensive philosophy built on outdated theories and personal vanities, championed by men who had never faced the Americans, who had never experienced what it meant to fight an enemy with absolute air supremacy and unlimited material resources. Chief among these was General Oberst Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, who advocated the classic German solution: hold the armor in reserve deep inland, allow the Allies to land, let them extend themselves, then launch a massive armored counterattack to drive them back into the sea. It was elegant, it was traditional, it was suicidal. Geyer was not alone in his convictions. He was supported by many in the German officer corps who still believed in the primacy of maneuver warfare, who still thought 1940 could be replayed, who could not accept that the conditions of war had fundamentally changed. They looked at maps and saw lines of advance, penetration points, encirclement opportunities. They did not see what Rommel saw: Allied fighter bombers strafing every road in daylight, turning vehicle columns into funeral pyres, naval guns with the range and accuracy to destroy concentrations miles inland, a logistics system so vast that it could land entire divisions with their equipment in a single day. Rommel had watched British and American aircraft dominate the skies over Tunisia. He had seen German columns destroyed from the air before they ever reached the battlefield. He knew that any large-scale movement of armor in daylight would be spotted, targeted, and obliterated long before it reached combat range. The theoretical counterattack would die on the roads of Normandy, burned to scrap metal by enemies the panzers would never even see. This was the core of Rommel's disagreement with the High Command, a disagreement that would echo through the bunkers and conference rooms of occupied France with increasing bitterness as winter turned to spring. Rommel demanded that everything, infantry, armor, artillery, obstacles, mines, be pushed as close to the beaches as possible. He wanted the panzers within 5 miles of the coast, positioned to counterattack within hours, not days. He wanted 500,000 mines laid along the beaches and in the shallow waters. He wanted steel obstacles, Czech hedgehogs, Belgian gates, wooden stakes tipped with mines, covering every inch of sand that might serve as a landing zone. He wanted the Atlantic Wall to become not a line, but a zone, a belt of death 10 miles deep that would consume the invasion before it could establish a foothold. He drove himself and his subordinates relentlessly, touring the defenses in his Horch staff car, appearing unannounced at construction sites, demanding explanations, issuing orders, clashing with engineers and logisticians who told him what he wanted was impossible with the resources available. Rommel didn't care about impossible, he cared about survival.
In the officers' messes and planning rooms, the younger staff officers whispered about Rommel's pessimism, his defeatism. Some questioned whether his experiences in Africa had broken his spirit, whether the desert fox had lost his nerve. They didn't understand that what they called pessimism was simply realism, the cold mathematical assessment of a commander who had learned to see through propaganda to the industrial reality beneath. Rommel had read the intelligence reports. He knew the Allies were assembling the largest amphibious force in human history in England. He knew they had more than 11,000 aircraft available for the invasion. He knew their bomber fleets could obliterate entire cities in a single night. He knew the Americans had production capacity that allowed them to build a Liberty ship in 42 days, a bomber in a month, a tank in an afternoon. Germany, strangled by strategic bombing and stretched across multiple fronts, could not match 1/10 of this output. The war had become a contest between German expertise and Allied abundance, and abundance was winning. This was the truth that Rommel's colleagues refused to accept. They still believed in German superiority, in training, in doctrine, in the individual quality of their soldiers and equipment. They believed that a smaller force of superior troops, skillfully handled, could defeat a larger force of inferior ones. This had been the Wehrmacht's operating assumption since 1939, and it had worked brilliantly in Poland, France, the Balkans, and the early campaigns in Russia. But by 1944, the Allies were no longer inferior. The Americans had learned from their early defeats in North Africa. They had refined their tactics, improved their coordination, developed specialized equipment and techniques for amphibious warfare. Most importantly, they had such overwhelming material superiority that they could afford to make mistakes,
to lose equipment, to try again. Germany could not. Every tank lost, every aircraft shot down, every experienced soldier killed was irreplaceable. The Wehrmacht was fighting with a finite inventory against an enemy whose inventory was, for practical purposes, infinite. Rommel tried to make his superiors understand this. In February 1944, he submitted a detailed report to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, outlining his assessment of the coastal defenses and his recommendations for improvement. The report was blunt to the point of insubordination. Rommel stated flatly that the invasion could not be stopped inland, that mobile defense was a fantasy, that the only chance for Germany was to hold the line at the beaches and prevent the enemy from ever establishing a foothold. He requested immediate authority to position the panzer divisions under his direct command, forward deployment of all available reserves, and a massive acceleration of the construction program for beach obstacles and minefields. Rundstedt, an old-school Prussian aristocrat who found Rommel's energy vulgar and his pessimism distasteful, forwarded the report to Berlin with lukewarm endorsement. The response from the high command was bureaucratic delay. The panzer divisions would remain under central control. Rommel would get additional labor for his construction projects, but not enough. He would get more mines, but a fraction of what he had requested. He would get promises and committees and further study. While the generals debated command structures and theoretical doctrines in their comfortable headquarters, Rommel drove the coastline. He visited every division sector, every regimental command post, every bunker and strong point along hundreds of miles of fortifications. He saw young soldiers shivering in incomplete positions, staring out at the sea with a mixture of fear and boredom. He saw the famous Atlantic Wall revealed for what it truly was, a discontinuous collection of strong points separated by long stretches of minimally defended beach with huge gaps in coverage and a fatal shortage of mobile reserves. In some sectors, the defenses were genuinely formidable. Reinforced concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, extensive minefields, proper communications. In others, there was almost nothing, a few strands of barbed wire, some elderly French guns without proper ammunition, trenches that flooded with every tide. The wall's strength existed primarily in German imaginations and Allied fears. Rommel set out to make the imagination real.
He became obsessed with obstacles. If he could not get enough soldiers or panzers, he would multiply force through engineering. He ordered the beaches sown with millions of wooden stakes, each angled seaward, each topped with a mine or shell, positioned to rip open landing craft at high tide. He demanded steel tetrahedrons, Czech hedgehogs, weighing hundreds of pounds each, to be fabricated in the thousands and planted across every potential landing zone. He wanted Belgian gates, curved steel rails that would trap vehicles and tanks in killing zones. He ordered the flooding of low-lying areas behind the beaches, creating marshes and swamps that would channel invaders into prepared fire zones. He had anti-glider stakes, nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, driven into every field and meadow where airborne troops might land, tens of thousands of wooden posts strung with wire and booby traps. He transformed the French countryside into a landscape of denial, a geography engineered to slow, channel, and kill. The work proceeded through winter and spring with desperate urgency. Thousands of forced laborers, French civilians, Russian POWs, impressed workers from across occupied Europe were driven into the coastal zones to dig, pour concrete, string wire, plant obstacles. The task was immense, the resources inadequate, the time too short. Rommel calculated that he needed 6 million mines to adequately cover the invasion beaches. By June, fewer than 1 million had been laid. He wanted 50,000 beach obstacles in place before the Allies came. By early spring, only a fraction existed. The Atlantic Wall was being built, but not fast enough, never fast enough. And always behind the desperate construction effort loomed the fundamental question: when the invasion came, who would control the German response? Would Rommel have authority to commit the panzer divisions immediately? Or would he have to request permission from Rundstedt, who would have to request permission from Berlin, by which time the battle would be lost? In March 1944, Rommel met personally with Hitler at the Berghof to press his case. The Führer received him warmly. Rommel was still the Reich's most famous general,
the hero of France and North Africa, the officer whose exploits had made him a propaganda icon. Hitler listened to Rommel's assessment with apparent attention. Rommel laid out the situation with characteristic bluntness. The Atlantic Wall was incomplete. The Allies enjoyed overwhelming material superiority. The invasion would come soon, and it had to be defeated on the beaches within the first 48 hours, or it could not be defeated at all. He requested full tactical control of all forces in the invasion sector, including the panzers. Hitler nodded, made encouraging noises, promised support. But when the meeting concluded and the formal orders were issued, nothing had fundamentally changed. Rommel received authority over 3 panzer divisions, a fraction of the armored strength in France. The rest remained under the convoluted command structure, subject to approval from multiple headquarters, ultimately requiring Hitler's personal authorization to move. The system was designed for control, not for speed. It would fail the test of invasion. What Rommel understood, what his strategic vision had crystallized around, was that modern warfare had entered a new phase where logistics and industrial capacity mattered more than operational brilliance. The Germans had been the masters of operational art, the inventors of blitzkrieg, the architects of mobile warfare. But operational art required freedom of movement, and movement required fuel, and fuel was something Germany increasingly lacked, while the Allies had in abundance. It required air superiority to protect moving columns, and Germany's Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, overwhelmed by American and British aircraft that now ruled European skies. It required the ability to concentrate force at the decisive point, and concentration required knowing where the decisive point would be, but the Allies had created an elaborate deception plan that made it nearly impossible to predict whether the invasion would come at Normandy or Pas-de-Calais. Every advantage that had made the Wehrmacht victorious in 1939 and 1940 had been systematically neutralized by 1944. What remained was the grim arithmetic of attrition, and Germany was losing.
April passed. May arrived. The weather warmed, the seas calmed, and every day that passed without invasion was another day for Rommel's engineers to sink obstacles and lay mines. But it was also another day for Allied bombers to systematically destroy the French transportation network, severing rail lines, demolishing bridges, cratering roads, isolating Normandy from reinforcement. The Allies were preparing the battlefield, shaping it to their advantage, and there was nothing the Germans could do to stop it. Rommel watched the destruction with growing apprehension. He knew what it meant. The Allies were not coming to Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route from England, where the strongest German defenses waited. They were coming to Normandy, where the defenses were weaker, the coastline more complex, the opportunities for surprise greater. He tried to reinforce Normandy, to shift resources, to prepare for what his instincts told him was coming. But the machinery of German command ground slowly, and every request became tangled in bureaucracy and competing priorities. On the beaches, the obstacles multiplied slowly. By late May, long belts of steel and wood bristled at the waterline, a forest of pointed stakes that would greet the invasion fleet. Behind them, minefields had been expanded, wire obstacles thickened, bunkers supplied and manned. The Atlantic Wall was stronger than it had been 6 months earlier, but it was not strong enough. Rommel knew it. In quiet moments, alone with his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, or with trusted subordinates like General Hans Speidel, his chief of staff, Rommel spoke with uncharacteristic despair. He said the invasion would come soon, that it might succeed, that Germany's only hope was a political settlement because military victory was no longer achievable. These were dangerous words in the Third Reich in 1944, where defeatism could mean death even for a field marshal. But Rommel had reached the point where truth mattered more than safety. He had seen too much, understood too much, to continue pretending that will and ideology could substitute for tanks and aircraft. In the German command structure, the division between Rommel and his colleagues widened into a chasm. Geyer von Speppenberg continued to insist that the panzers remain inland, available for a concentrated counterstroke. Rommel argued with increasing vehemence that this was suicide, that the armored divisions would be destroyed by air attack before they ever engaged the enemy. The argument consumed countless hours in staff meetings and planning sessions, with neither side yielding. Rundstedt, caught between his subordinates and increasingly detached from operational reality, sided generally with Geyer, not because he was convinced Geyer was right, but because Geyer's approach was more consistent with traditional German military doctrine. The dispute was ultimately referred to Hitler, who made the worst possible decision. He split the difference. Some panzer divisions would go to Rommel, some would remain in reserve under central control, and some would require Hitler's personal approval to move. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and guaranteed that when the crisis came, the German response would be slow, confused, and fatally uncoordinated. The symbolic object that haunted Rommel through these months was that single rusted stake he had picked up in January, an artifact of inadequacy, a monument to the gap between what was needed and what was possible. He carried it with him, metaphorically if not literally, as a reminder of the material reality that his colleagues refused to acknowledge. The stake was not a weapon, it was a wish, a hope that enough wishes piled along enough beaches might somehow stop the most powerful industrial nations on Earth. Rommel understood the absurdity, but he also understood that wishes and stakes were all Germany had left. So he drove his engineers harder, inspected more positions, wrote more urgent reports, and tried to build a wall from insufficient stones. On June 4, 1944, Rommel was at his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, a chateau carved into limestone cliffs overlooking the Seine. The weather had turned foul, high winds, heavy seas, low clouds. Intelligence reported no unusual Allied activity. The meteorologists assured him that invasion conditions would be impossible for at least another week. Rommel, exhausted from months of relentless inspection tours and escalating arguments with his superiors, decided to return to Germany for a brief visit. It was his wife Lucy's birthday on June 6th, and he had not seen her in months. He also planned to meet with Hitler again to make one final appeal for control of the panzer reserves. On June 5th, Rommel left France. His chief of staff, Speidel, held command in his absence. Many senior officers were away from their posts, some at war games in Brittany, some on leave, some inspecting distant sectors. The Atlantic Wall stood guard, but its commanders were scattered.
In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the invasion came, not at Pas-de-Calais, where the strongest defenses waited, but at Normandy, exactly where Rommel had feared. Allied paratroopers dropped through the darkness onto the Cotentin Peninsula and the fields east of Caen, sowing chaos behind the coastal defenses. At dawn, an armada of more than 5,000 ships materialized off the Normandy coast through the clearing weather, the largest amphibious fleet ever assembled, carrying 150,000 men who would land on 5 beaches across 50 miles of coastline. Naval guns opened fire, pulverizing German strongpoints with shells the size of automobiles. Bombers roared overhead in waves, dropping thousands of tons of explosives onto defensive positions. And then the landing craft surged toward shore, toward Rommel's obstacles, toward the Atlantic Wall, toward the moment of truth that would decide whether Germany could survive or would be crushed beneath the weight of Allied material superiority. Rommel was 600 miles away when the call came. He immediately ordered his staff car prepared and began the long drive back to France, racing through Germany toward a battle that had already begun without him. The panzer divisions that might have crushed the invasion in its first hours sat immobile, awaiting authorization to move, authorization that required Hitler's approval, and Hitler was asleep at the Berghof, and his staff refused to wake him. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned nearest to the beaches, finally received permission to counterattack late in the afternoon of June 6th, but by then, the Allies were ashore in strength, supported by naval guns and complete air superiority. The German counterattack disintegrated under airstrikes and naval bombardment. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a foothold. By the end of the week, they had landed more than 300,000 men. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, exactly as Rommel had predicted it would be if the mobile reserves were not positioned forward and released immediately. The battle for Normandy became a grinding, attritional nightmare for the Wehrmacht, precisely the kind of fight Rommel had warned could not be won. German units fought with desperate skill and courage, but they were systematically destroyed by an enemy who could afford losses and always return with more men, more tanks, more shells, more aircraft.
Every German counterattack was spotted from the air and crushed by naval gunfire or airstrikes. Supply lines were shredded. Reinforcements arrived in fragments, having lost half their strength to air attack during the approach march. The panzer divisions that Geyer had wanted to hold in reserve for a concentrated counterstroke were committed piecemeal, fed into the battle in small packets, and destroyed without ever achieving the decisive blow they were supposed to deliver. Rommel's vision of stopping the invasion at the water's edge had been the correct one, but it had been rejected, and now Germany was paying the price. In the weeks after D-Day, Rommel watched his predictions come true with the grim satisfaction of a prophet whose warnings had been ignored. He saw his carefully prepared defenses overwhelmed by sheer material weight. He saw his undermanned divisions ground down by an enemy who attacked constantly, from all directions, with unlimited resources. He saw the Luftwaffe almost completely absent from the skies, while Allied aircraft hunted German troops like wolves hunting sheep. He saw the transportation network so thoroughly destroyed that moving a single panzer division from southern France to Normandy took a week and cost half its vehicles. He saw that Germany had lost the initiative and would never regain it, that from this point forward, the war would be a slow retreat toward destruction. And he saw that his colleagues, the generals who had dismissed his warnings as pessimism, who had insisted on mobile defense and armored counterstrokes, were finally, belatedly beginning to understand what he had known since January, that they had lost, that the disaster was irreversible, that the Reich was doomed.
On July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British fighter bombers near the village of St. Foy de Montgomery. The vehicle crashed. Rommel suffered a fractured skull, severe facial injuries, and multiple broken bones. He was evacuated to a hospital, removed from command, eliminated from the battle at the moment when his expertise and reputation were most needed. By then, it no longer mattered. The Normandy campaign ground on without him, a brutal contest of attrition that Germany could not win. In August, the American breakout at St. Lo shattered the German line. The Falaise pocket swallowed 2 entire German armies. Paris was liberated. By September, Allied armies were advancing toward the German border, and the Third Reich was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Rommel never returned to active command. In October, implicated by association with the failed July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler, he was given a choice: public trial and execution with reprisals against his family, or suicide with a state funeral and protection for his loved ones. On October 14, 1944, Rommel took poison in the back of an SS staff car parked outside his home in Herrlingen. The Third Reich mourned its fallen hero with elaborate ceremony, never acknowledging that he had been murdered by the regime he had served. His warnings, his plans, his desperate attempts to prepare for the inevitable, all of it died with him, vindicated by events, but rejected by the system he had tried to save. The Atlantic Wall stands today in fragments along the coast of France, a ruin of concrete and rust, a monument to insufficient preparation and rejected wisdom. Tourists climb through the bunkers at Pointe du Hoc and Omaha Beach, studying the fields of fire and the gun positions, imagining the battle. The obstacles are long gone, cleared by Allied engineers in the days after the invasion, or buried beneath decades of shifting sand. But the lesson remains, embedded in the history like Rommel's iron stake driven into the beach, that wars are won not by ideology or will, but by steel and petroleum and industrial capacity. That courage and skill cannot substitute for resources when the resource gap becomes too wide. That brilliant generals cannot compensate for strategic blindness at the highest levels of command. That warnings unheeded become epitaphs. Rommel saw the disaster coming. He documented it, planned for it, tried to prevent it. His generals, products of a military culture that valued offensive spirit and operational brilliance over material calculation, could not accept his assessment, because accepting it would mean acknowledging that Germany had already lost, that the war was unwinnable, that all the sacrifice and suffering would end in defeat. So they clung to theories of mobile defense and armored counterstrokes, to belief in German superiority and Allied incompetence,
to dreams of miracle weapons and political collapse that would save the Reich at the last moment. They didn't listen because listening would have required changing everything: command structures, deployments, even the fundamental strategic assumptions on which German planning rested. It was easier to dismiss Rommel as a pessimist than to confront the reality he represented. And so the invasion came, and the Atlantic Wall crumbled, and the panzer divisions that might have made a difference were too far away, or lacked fuel, or were destroyed from the air before they reached the battlefield. The disaster Rommel had foreseen unfolded exactly as he had predicted, a slow-motion catastrophe that consumed Army Group B and eventually consumed the Third Reich itself. In the end, the abundance of American industry and the ruthless logic of material warfare prevailed over German expertise and ideological fervor. The Allies did not win because they were better soldiers, though by 1944 they were very good indeed. They won because they could afford to lose ships and tanks and aircraft and still return the next day with more, because their factories could not be bombed into silence, because their logistics system could supply entire armies across an ocean, because they had transformed war into an industrial process at which they excelled. Germany, for all its military skill and technological sophistication, could not compete with that. Rommel understood this. His failure was not in vision, but in persuasion. He saw the future and could not make others believe it until the future arrived and destroyed them.
The iron stake, rusted and inadequate, driven into sand that would not hold it. That was the Atlantic Wall. That was the Third Reich's defense of Europe. That was the gap between what was needed and what was possible when a nation wages war beyond its means against enemies whose means are, for practical purposes, unlimited. Rommel tried to bridge that gap with engineering and cunning and desperate urgency. He failed, not because he was wrong, but because he was right too late, and because the machinery of German command could not adapt quickly enough to the new realities of modern war. The disaster came, as he knew it would, and no one listened until there was nothing left to hear but the sound of Allied tanks driving eastward toward Berlin, crushing the dreams of empire beneath steel treads on roads paved with inadequate iron stakes and shattered ideology.